everyone, my name is Megan Quiñones, and you can call me Miss Megan, Miss Quiñones, Miss Q, whichever works best for you, and I am a Food Corps AmeriCorps service member at the Mayor's Office of Food Access in Boston, Massachusetts, and I am so excited to share that we'll be learning all about farm workers today through learning different lessons and participating in activities, and I can't wait anymore. So let's go get started. Today we are going to learn more about the history of farm work and farm workers in the United States. But before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Pawtucket people, the original caretakers of the unceded land that is now known as Somerville, Massachusetts. I encourage you all to visit native-land.ca to learn about the original caretakers and indigenous history of the land on which you reside that was violently colonized by the United States. I also encourage you to learn about issues still impacting Indigenous people today because Indigenous people are still here. Farm work and land are deeply connected, and this is something I would like you all to keep in mind as we learn more about the history of farm work and farm workers today. To give some context, a farm worker is defined as a person employed to work on a farm. However, the history of farm workers in the United States is much more complicated than it sounds. When we hear farm worker, sometimes we confuse this with farmer, or we just think of figures like Cesar Chavez and sometimes Dolores Huerta. But farm work, and who we know farm workers to be, has continued to shift and transform since the beginning of colonization within the U.S. And while I would love to provide a jam-packed history lesson, today will be more of an overview because this is such a complicated subject. I'll also include a list of resources and links in the description of this video so you can do more research on your own. It first began during the 1600s with indentured servants brought from England who worked as farm workers in fields and were paid a small amount, being told it would one day be enough money to buy their freedom in the New World, or what is now known as the United States of America. However, indentured servants were not considered a sustainable or large enough workforce. This gave birth to slavery in the U.S., where Africans were forcibly stolen from their home countries and then brought here to the U.S. as enslaved peoples forced to work in fields and sometimes domestically. We also begin to see a rise in migrant farm workers from Mexico as a result of the Mexican-American War, which occurred from 1846 to 1848. These farm workers would sometimes stay in the U.S., but would often return home at the end of the growing season. I highlight the year 1863 because that is the year President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which we are often taught to be the day President Lincoln freed enslaved people. However, this was only true in some parts of the country at the time. June 19th, 1865 is the true day enslaved people were freed in the U.S. and was first celebrated in Galveston, Texas, known as Liberation Day, Emancipation Day, or most commonly, Juneteenth. However, Black and African American workers continue to face unequal treatment due to Black codes, which were repealed in 1866. During the 1860s through the 1930s, more Black and African American people are beginning to work in different industries. During this time period, the U.S. also begins to import workers from Asia, particularly from China, Japan, and the Philippines. In fact, during 1866, 7 out of 8 farm workers in the U.S. were Chinese. However, Black and African American workers continue to face unequal treatment between 1870 and 1965 during the Jim Crow era, despite the idea that Black and African American people were now considered free. Black farm workers were particularly impacted by sharecropping and the New Deal. In 1882, the U.S. passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was a discriminatory act stopping Chinese workers from coming to the U.S. This is another important date because it shows a shift that is beginning to happen in the population of who is doing the hard labor of farm work in the U.S. World War I limits the workforce for agriculture, further causing the U.S. to depend on Mexico for labor, which leads to the passage of the first guest worker program in the country. This brought 70,000 workers from Mexico to the U.S., but the program is ended in 1921. From the 1920s to the 1930s, we begin to see a large but often forgotten influx of workers from the Philippines in California. While they were told the U.S. is where they could make their dreams a reality, they were instead met with the racist threats and violence. Filipino people had little choice but to do the manual labor of farm work in California just to survive. In the 1930s, the U.S. is still dealing with the Great Depression, which caused unforeseen amounts of poverty. And then the Dust Bowl happened, which destroyed farmlands across the Midwestern region of this country, leading many white people to become migrant workers in states such as California. There was also an influx of Black and African American workers to California during this time. During World War II, the U.S. sees another shortage of workers, leading them to create the Bracero program in 1942 and import Mexican workers to the U.S. temporarily to complete farm work. This program ended in 1965 due to egregious, which is a scholarly way to say awful, working conditions experienced by Mexican farm workers. Larry Itliong and Felipe Veracruz were leaders within the Filipino Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, who convinced 2,000 Filipino farm workers to walk off the vineyards in California, igniting the Delano grape strike. 12 days later, the United Farm Workers, led by Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, joined the fight. The 1960s and 70s became an era of action and change towards increased civil and human rights, sending shockwaves throughout the United States, and this was no different for farm workers leading boycotts. In 1970, the work of Itliong, Veracruz, Chavez, and Huerta, and countless others resulted in a victory where the Delano Company agreed to the farm workers' demands. Wow. We just learned so much together, so let's just take a moment to pause and let all this information sink in. Okay, now let's take a deep breath together. Inhale, hold, exhale. Despite the activism of farm workers in the 60s and 70s, farm workers continue to face unfair treatment, often referred to as exploitation, to this day. And as much as I love to talk about history, we only have so much time, so we're going to fast forward back to the present to talk about some current issues farm workers are facing today. Let's be honest. From what we have learned today, it's become clear that agriculture or farming within the United States is rooted in disenfranchisement, abuse, and exploitation of workers, which simply means farm workers have never been treated in a way that is fair or just within this country. Now we'll begin to discuss some of the issues facing farm workers today. Farm workers are often paid so little it is nearly impossible for them to have what they need for them and their families to survive. Over time, other types of workers see their wages increase, but farm worker wages haven't increased since 2009, according to the National Agriculture Workers Survey. They also do not receive disability, health insurance, or overtime pay. Legally, farm workers can be paid below the national minimum wage of $7.25 due to farm work being considered a piece wage job where workers are paid for the amount of product harvested rather than how many hours they work. The National Ministry for Farm Workers provide this example to help us better understand piece wages. For instance, the piece rate for sweet potatoes in North Carolina averages 45 cents per 35-pound bucket. Average productivity for a worker is about 15 buckets per hour, which means that during an 8-hour workday, a worker will produce 120 buckets of sweet potatoes, or 4,375 pounds of sweet potatoes. Whoa! According to the 45-cent piece rate, a worker would receive only $6.75 an hour, which is less than North Carolina's $7.25 minimum wage. Yet low pay is not the only issue experienced by farm workers today. Working conditions on the fields are still very poor. Farm workers do not get to take sick days. They have limited access to clean water while working on the fields. Sometimes they're not allowed to take breaks in the shade to cool down. And they can even be verbally abused or bullied by their bosses. Women see an increased risk of violence from their bosses, including verbal, physical, and even sexual abuse. Did you know 25% or every 1 out of 4 farm workers are women? Yet various sources estimate that anywhere from 80% to 90% of these farm worker women face abuse on the fields. Child labor is another issue experienced among farm worker communities. In special circumstances, children aged 10 and 11 can be granted permission to work in the fields, though the typical ages that require parent permission and depend on the type of farm that allow children to work on the field range from 12, 14, 16, and 18 years old. Most recently, COVID-19 has presented major challenges to farm worker communities as they are often rural, lack access to personal protective equipment, general medical care, and COVID-19 testing. There's also no way to socially distance while working on the fields. Vaccination rollout has been incredibly slow in many farm worker communities, despite farm workers being deemed essential workers during the start of the pandemic. Now you may be wondering, why don't farm workers do something about the way that they're being treated? That's what they've done in the past. And that's a really valid question. Unfortunately, the answers are about as complicated and confusing as all of that history we went over earlier. Immigration is a big factor. Some farm workers are what's known as migrant farm workers, meaning they are on temporary visas allowing them to work in the U.S. Some farm workers are also undocumented. These factors often stop farm workers from speaking up because their bosses could fire them, and their bosses could even report them to Immigration Customs Enforcement, which can also result to a loss of job and even deportation. Both language and literacy, or the ability to read and write, can prevent farm workers from fully understanding their contracts or what rights they have as workers. While the majority of farm workers today are Latino, Latina, Latinx, some farm workers from Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras do not speak English or Spanish. Rather, they speak languages that are indigenous to the regions that they're from. Farm workers are also limited in creating unions because of the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. A 2019 study found that only 1% of farm workers belong to a union. Unions are important because they allow workers to organize and demand better working conditions. Unions also stop workers from being fired for organizing. Now that was a lot more information, and some of which may have even felt like some heavy stuff to learn about. So let's just take another moment to pause and breathe. All right, inhale with me. Hold, and release. Because there is hope. Farm workers have stayed committed to action, with a variety of campaigns and boycotts launched right now throughout the country. We just haven't heard about it. So I'm about to share some different ways that we can support farm workers in our everyday lives. We can start by, you guessed it, continuing to learn. I am about to list some organizations either led by farm workers or created to support farm workers if you're feeling inspired to learn more about the work organizations are doing. These organizations include Coalition of Immokalee Workers, National Ministry for Farm Workers, Farm Labor Organizing Committee, Food Chain Workers Alliance, Student Action with Farm Workers, United Farm Workers of America, Alliance for Fair Food, Walk Free, Student Farm Worker Alliance, Migrant Justice or Justicia Migrante, Farm Worker Justice, La Cosecha, Pineros y Campesinos Unidos del Noroeste or PCUN. We just learned so much together, and it would be a shame if you didn't share all this new information with a friend or someone at home. If this really interests you, you can even pick it up as a topic to study for class so you can share more about this with your peers. Sharing is one of my favorite things to do. In my personal life, farm worker justice is a passion of mine and something I did research around in college. One year, on Halloween, I gave a presentation about farm work and pesticides and ended it with this slide, which I'm sharing with you all today. Civic engagement can mean many different things. It can be signing a petition, participating in a boycott, writing a letter to an elected official, and so much more. One great way to take action today is through signing this petition urging Florida Governor DeSantis to prioritize vaccine for frontline farm workers in Florida. Giving this presentation is particularly special because it's Farm Workers Awareness Week, and now we're so much more aware of what we can do to support farm workers who are organizing and other organizations out there to support farm workers. We're now going to take everything that we've learned today and end our lesson with a mindful eating exercise. If you're able to grab a fruit or veggie, whether it's from home, school, or the fresh fruit and vegetable program, please do that now because that is an important part of this next activity. Now, I just want you to hold that fruit or veggie in your hand, close your eyes if you feel comfortable, and think about everything we've learned today. First, I want you to think about the land this fruit or veggie may have come from. Do you know where this was grown? Do you know whose land this belongs to? Who the first caretakers were? Do you know the history of these people? Do you know their current realities? Now that we've thought about the land, I want you to think about the people who grow this produce, who planted the seeds, who did the harvesting. If this produce was it shipped by truck, boat, plane, or another way? And lastly, I want you to think about who helped you get this produce. Did you or someone in your home purchase it from a grocery store? Were you or someone in your home helped by an essential employee? Was this produce given to you by food and nutrition staff at your school? Was it grown in a garden? Just take a second and think about it. Wow, who knew there were so many people involved in getting this produce to you? Now, I want you each to say those 2 magic words with me. Thank you. Now, before we eat our produce, don't worry, we'll get there soon. We're going to complete a 5 senses activity specific to our fruit or vegetable. You can open your eyes now if you haven't already. Let's start by thinking about the way our produce feels, since it's been sitting in our hand for all this time now. What does it feel like? Is it smooth? Is it bumpy, soft, furry, prickly? Think about it. Now we'll transition to sight. What does this produce look like? Does it have bruises? What color is it? Is it multiple colors? Does it look really big or really tiny? Think about it. Does this produce make a noise or any sound if you move it? Do two pieces of this produce touch each other and then make a noise? What does this produce smell like? Is it sweet? Does it smell tangy, ripe, stinky? Does it have a smell at all? Okay, and now this is the moment that we've been waiting for. Drum roll. Taste! What does your produce taste like? Is it sweet, sour, spicy, bitter, acidic? Does it have a taste? By now, you should each be trying your fruit or veggie, so I'll just leave you with one last question, and you don't have to answer it. Just call it food for thought. Pun intended. Did your fruit or veggie taste any different after thinking about the questions I asked and us using our 5 senses? And remember, you don't have to answer this one, just some food for thought. I hope you're each enjoying your fruit and veggies. Thank you so much for taking the time to participate in this activity with me. And always remember, if you get the chance, thank a farm worker too.